apologies for the technical hiccup. Let us begin again. Good evening and welcome to another virtual book discussion by the Observer Research Foundation. Up for discussion today is Dr. Stephen Wertheim's latest work, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of US Global Supremacy. Most of us know Dr. Wertheim for his continued and extensive critique of American militarism. Like I said, I am an ardent follower. He is currently also the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. We also have an august roster of discussants today. Ambassador Meera Shankar, former Indian ambassador to the US, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, noted academic and founder and honorary chair of Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies, Mr. Vergees George, associate editor at The Hindu, and Ms. Nikhila Natarajan, my senior colleague from ORF America. Before we begin, let me congratulate Dr. Wertheim on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation for the publication of this very timely book. I enjoyed reading it over the past weekend, and I also think it is certain to play an active role in shaping Washington's discourse, particularly with respect to debunking the false equivalency between restrained views of American power and outright isolationism. Most importantly, in tracing the history of American internationalism, Dr. Wertheim dwells into the policy deliberations of the pre and post World War II era to decry the assumption that isolationism had been prevalent at the time, when in fact, as Dr. Wertheim notes, isolationism was merely a quote-unquote phantom enemy which performed a useful function for internationalists and US small policymakers of the time to delegitimize voices against US armed primacy. So without much further ado, let me invite Dr. Wertheim to give his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Well, many thanks for your generous words. I'm delighted to be with you this evening or this morning, and I am grateful to all the participants for reading the book and being willing to get on to our virtual environment and discuss it. The discussion is exactly what I look forward to. I am tired of hearing myself talk about my own book, so let me be as brief as possible in explaining why I wrote the book and why I think it matters for the past and for the present. I wrote Tomorrow the World out of curiosity and a little frustration. Throughout my own lifetime, I heard constantly from people in the town behind me, which is Washington, D.C., that, of course, the United States must maintain military dominance across the world with globe-spanning alliances and forces stationed permanently in basically every region. And yet, reasons were seldom produced, at least very deeply, for why America should play such a role at this point in history. Military dominance struck me as an unexamined premise of American policymaking rather than a conclusion derived from scrutiny of America's interests in the world and changes in the international environment. So I wanted to know where this consensus in favor of global military primacy came from historically. And I figured that at some point, a conscious decision must have been made to adopt such a role. After all, the United States did not set out from the founding of the Republic to take such a large political and military role. Global dominance was hardly foreseen by George Washington, who advised the nation to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. And for many generations, Washington's successors followed his advice, aiming to keep America out of what they construed as entanglements in Europe and Asia, even as they vastly expanded, of course, American power in the Western Hemisphere and into the Western Pacific. So my question was this: how and why did American leaders decide their country should become the supreme military power on Earth, holding itself responsible for enforcing order on a global scale? So this seems like a basic question, but I realized I'd have to try to answer it because the scholarship on the subject actually obscures it. In the scholarship and in American politics and culture, there is a dominant narrative that addresses the story. And it tells the story something like this. For a long time, America was isolationist. Around the turn of the 20th century, some internationalists emerged who wanted the United States to fully enter world affairs, and they competed for influence with the isolationists. But the isolationists remained strong through the 1930s. And eventually, once Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, America finally awoke to the dangers of the world, cast aside its reluctance, and embraced internationalism. So I came to see that narrative as essentially wrong. It's ahistorical. It acts as though internationalists favored military dominance all along. They just needed to sweep their opponents out of the way. But in fact, few self-described internationalists prior to World War II sought military preeminence. What made them internationalists, actually, if you ask them, was their desire to avoid war, prevent conflict, and transcend power politics through forms of peaceful interaction. And then there were no isolationists in America, period. Isolationism is a myth. The term was invented in the 1930s and 40s and used to discredit those who wanted the United States to defend the entire Western Hemisphere by force, but keep out of war in Europe and Asia. So yes, there was widespread opposition to making military commitments in Eurasia. That's very important. But even internationalists shared that opposition until suddenly they didn't. So only a rupture would change American thinking and make internationalism seem to require armed dominance. And I argue in the book that the rupture came after Nazi Germany conquered France within just 6 weeks in the middle of 1940. For the first time, Americans faced the credible prospect that totalitarian powers could invade their way to preeminence in Europe and Asia. But what was the problem for the United States? Few observers believed that North America faced much danger of being successfully invaded from across the oceans. And the US economy was so self-contained, especially after the Depression, that it didn't need much foreign trade. America, in other words, remained safe and prosperous. For that reason, some Americans argued, beginning in the second half of 1940, that the United States should build its military strength so it could effectively guard the hemisphere against any outside invasion, but it should not commit to go further. This was the view of a coalition of Americans who gathered under the banner of America First. And I have to ask you to detach your recent notions of America First from our own moment from the historical one. But most foreign policy elites at the time came to a different view. Officials and intellectuals were already planning the post-war world in places like the Council on Foreign Relations, and they aspired to more than security or prosperity. As before, they wished to interact and transact in a decent world order and have America define its direction. But now they determined the only way to have such an order was to defend it by force, by overwhelming force. That is, Americans understood Hitler's conquests to prove the failure of internationalism as previously understood. Peaceful interaction couldn't overcome war and conquest. Rather, it depended on armed force in order to exist at all. And then they wondered, even if the Nazis failed this time to attain preeminence, who might try next to impose a totalitarian order on a large portion of the world? So even before the attack on Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, American planners were preparing to take up arms, not only to defeat the enemy of today, but also and especially to deter tomorrow's potential adversaries. Consider just what the intellectual and publisher Henry Luce wrote in his famous essay that announced the arrival of the American century. He wrote this essay in February of 1941, months before Pearl Harbor. Tyrannies may require a large amount of living space, he wrote, but freedom requires and will require far greater living space than tyranny. So that's the main story I tell in the book. And if my story is right, I think it does tell us something fundamental and paradoxical about US foreign policy today. On the one hand, America's desire for military dominance outlasted the Cold War competition with Soviet communism. Dominance was originally conceived as a perpetual or open ended project. It wasn't just intended to counter an actually existing great power rival, rather, it was intended to underpin a general world order. On the other hand, primacy has, in a sense, outlived its original purpose. The original case for primacy depended upon the specter of an alternative totalitarian order that could attain preeminence and block off liberal intercourse. But in today's world, the world of the post Cold War era, a world without totalitarian conquerors, for 3 decades now, armed dominance has become rather difficult to justify to Americans themselves. It's true that today America's large military budgets sail through Congress year after year, and yet I believe that the project of world leadership faces a crisis of legitimacy at home. And yes, I do think the election of Donald Trump 4 years ago is something of a symptom rather, of that crisis of legitimacy. So let me just say in closing, I have plenty of views on what I think a U.S. foreign policy should be going forward. Happy to discuss those. But I want to emphasize that this book is a work of history. And I hope most of all that it sharpens our understanding of what happened and why. And if people draw divergent lessons for what should happen now, I think that's wonderful from the perspective of a historian.
Hmm.
But I certainly do hope that the book will open us up to think outside the boundaries established in World War II. As the book describes, American policy elites, after deciding to install the United States as an armed superpower, then devised a new narrative that turned military dominance into the defining feature of American internationalism, which they now oppose to this new coinage, isolationism. And the result was to make America's ascent seem natural and inarguable, and tarnish all possible alternatives to dominance as beyond the pale. I think that was a mistake. I think that was a costly mistake. And I hope that going forward, American leaders and citizens will be willing to be more creative about the challenges that we face in the 21st century. So I will just leave things there for now and very much look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Wertheim. A small note for our viewers. If you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A chat box and we'll get to them momentarily. Now, before I invite interventions from our esteemed discussants, let me slip in a quick follow-up for Dr. Wertheim. So you mentioned, you tried to put this in context of what's happening now, right, with respect to defense budgets and how, to a certain extent, that anti-isolationist chorus still exists today. I'm using the phrase that you use in your book. Another thing that you reference in your book is that internationalists in the post-war period would often cite a 1942 Gallup poll, whereby 73% Americans supported US activism abroad. Now, that's a bit different today, right? Like in contemporary times, you have a 2016 Pew Research poll which said that 6 in 10 Americans now say the US should focus on its own problems. Moreover, on both corners of the American political spectrum, with progressives on the left and conservative nationalists on the right, there seems to be an odd convergence between the two sides on, say, opposition to endless wars or having a conscientious trade policy. In your assessment, then, how will internationalism face or fare this time around when, unlike the post-war period, the opposition seems to be ascendant and quite real?
Thank you. I do think there has been a notable shift in the United States in high-level politics and among the public, as you say. That's born in a proximate sense of frustration with what have been called the endless wars in the greater Middle East, the path that the United States has been on since the 9/11 attacks 2 decades ago. But I think what's happening right now is, I would say, a contest between two fairly coherent grand strategies for the United States. So
Hmm.
one of them, as you mentioned, would be a grand strategy of restraint that sees the United States pulling back with its military, with its security commitments, and its forward deployed armed forces pretty much across the board. There's more support for that in the Middle East than anywhere else. And East Asia or the Indo Pacific would be the most contentious area. But then there's also another pretty coherent alternative, which is great power competition, as the Pentagon has termed it now for about 4 years. And that alternative would, in a sense, also abandon this kind of undifferentiated global primacy in order to focus the United States on managing the challenge of the rise of China in particular. And the assertion of Russia has often been lumped in, though you might wonder whether the United States would be interested in trying to play the two powers off one another. But those two options, I think, are both rising in tandem. And to some extent, they converge on a desire to do less in the Middle East. Then things get more contentious when you turn to not only the Indo Pacific, but also Europe. And so I think we're maybe just at the point where both of those sides have strengthened enough that we'll start to see a direct confrontation between the two. Although it must be said, despite the Biden administration's desire to withdraw ground troops from Afghanistan, the U.S. is still, the war on terror continues. The endless wars in the Middle East essentially continue in a somewhat lighter footprint than before, but over a vast geography. So it's not as though the kind of strategic focus offered by either of the two options I mentioned has yet actually come to pass.
Right. Point taken. I think it remains to be seen how the progressives will interact with the conservative nationalists on some of their own convergences. Let me now move to Ambassador Meera Shankar. Ma'am, apart from your thoughts on the book, I'm curious about your frontline diplomatic experience with American internationalism. Because one may argue India has seen both sides of it, right? With respect to, say, India experiencing US military intimidation in 1972 during the liberation of Bangladesh, and in the post Cold War era, US has also leveraged all its diplomatic might to assimilate India into the global non-proliferation regime. So we've had it both ways. We've experienced both sides of the US internationalism coin. You were in DC at a very pivotal juncture in India US relations. Please tell us how US India ties have been impacted by American internationalism and how that has changed over time.
Well, firstly, let me congratulate Dr. Wertheim on the book. It challenges the conventional wisdom of the inevitability of America being the dominant power and the projection that this is America's manifest destiny. He has gone back to the historical roots of choice that the US made, moving from a more restrained understanding of internationalism, where you engage with the world but stay out or transcend balance of power politics, and nationalism, which was the dominant narrative in Europe. But one where internationalism is now conflated with US military primacy. And he has done very, very meticulous research on the publications, the foundations, the think tanks, the officials who actually helped this transition to evolve from this policy of restraint or keeping America more restricted to the Western Hemisphere, to one where it became a part of the US's self-understanding that US military primacy or dominance in the world would be the open-ended policy that the US should adopt and would adopt. It actually opens a debate and also reflects the zeitgeist, if I may, in America, because for the first time you really have a conscious questioning of the inevitability of US playing the world's military, the world's policemen, and the world's development bank, or whatever if you will. You had President Trump, who really came to power on a policy of putting America first, of course, defined in a very different way from the initial America First movement. But he conflated it with military dominance, but actually atrophied the other instruments of US power across the world, whether it was global cooperation on a range of issues, or whether it was financial or developmental assistance, or whether it was working together on issues like climate change or the pandemic. I think the other instruments of US power were allowed to atrophy, while spending on the military actually increased manyfold. Now, I think the questioning has a lot to do with the economic changes within the United States, which has seen in recent years the primacy of financial capital with all its attendant risks, as compared to an actual manufacturing industrial base, which it had in the past and where it was the preeminent power. You see the constraints that the US is facing economically after the 2008 financial crisis, even though to some extent there has been better recovery in the US than in some of the other countries affected. It certainly is nowhere back to the position that it used to enjoy post-war of uncontested economic and technological primacy. We have seen the emergence of new powers like China. We have seen, which actually is a technological and economic challenge to the United States at present. And as a result of which, you see the strategic competition between the two also sharpening. But driving a lot of this is the economic element, because people have lost jobs with industry shifting, production shifting to China. Jobs have been perceived to be lost in the services sector, where there's been outsourcing to India. And there's also this feeling that this whole process has exerted a downward pressure on US wages, and therefore US workers and the lower middle class have actually had to see a stagnation of incomes for many, many, many years. And so the question that arises for many of these constituencies in the US is, A, that the US should re-look at some of its overextended military policies across the world and focus instead on rebuilding its own domestic strength. Now, as I think our moderator mentioned, on this, there seems to be a consensus between the progressives in the Democratic Party and the Trump conservatives, where both would like to retrench, in a sense, America's role globally and focus inward. So economics, to some extent, and political opinion within the US actually now are pushing a re-look at these old policies. You're seeing that in the exhaustion with the forever wars, where there is complete consensus on withdrawing troops from Afghanistan across the political spectrum. Maybe the military may have wanted a slightly longer or more phased out withdrawal, but clearly the politics in the United States is in favor of withdrawal. There's been withdrawal from Iraq, some thinning down of what the US was trying to do in Syria. And in Libya, the US is still coping with the anarchy which was let loose after the overthrow of Gaddafi. So I think this consensus will lead to questioning. The question is, how will the US, reorganize its role in the world?
Yes.
From India's point of view, any precipitate withdrawal from the Asia Pacific would leave China in a very dominant position in Asia. And we have been subjected to fairly aggressive policies by China on the border, as have other neighbors, Japan over the island dispute, Taiwan, which has seen most recently nuclear bombers and aircraft intrude into its economic space, and the then in the South China Sea. So
Right.
we have seen pretty aggressive action by China on border disputes and a tendency to use its military power and its economic clout to browbeat neighbors into submission and accept, in a sense, their replacement of American dominance in Asia as inevitable. So,
Right.
from the point of view of Asian countries, I think an American role to balance China, but one which also does not preclude cooperation on global issues such as the pandemic or climate change or nuclear proliferation. There are a range of global issues which really would require China's cooperation. So a more nuanced policy, perhaps,
Right.
of dealing with China, which possibly is what the Biden administration has set out to do.
Yeah.
I think in America, the consensus for continuing to deal with China as they had in the past, which was primarily on a cooperative basis, because they thought that China provided economic opportunities, and B, that economic engagement and prosperity in China would perhaps change the political dynamic in China towards greater openness. This really hasn't happened. And
Yep.
so this, along with the economic and technological competition, which has sharpened, I think raises the question that America needs to perhaps relook how it has dealt with China. Again, neither an either or situation, either we have conflict or we cooperate. I think it has to be a more nuanced policy, which will have elements of both
Yep.
competition and cooperation.
That's right.
At the end, I would again congratulate Professor Wertheim for his book and say that it was a pleasure to read it. A bit dense in terms of detail, so not something you can glance through very quickly, but all the more solid for that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Shankar. Let me quickly turn to Professor Mahapatra. So Dr. Wertheim, in his book, notes that the idea of having a UN General Assembly and then having a UN Security Council as well, helped America square the circle on maintaining exclusive control on world politics by a small club of great powers, while at the same time having an illusion or a veneer of universal participation. At one point, as Dr. Wertheim quotes in his book, FDR even said that the UNGA is nothing but a place where small countries can come and merely blow off steam. I want to know, in your assessment, would you agree that is still the realpolitik consideration with which the US approaches the UN system and the older system? And essentially, a question closer to home: is India then chasing fool's gold with its advocacy for UN reforms?
Right. There are two things. Of course, I'll come to a question that you asked later. Initially, a little bit about the book. Uh, Dr. Stephen Wertheim has written really an intellectual history of the US foreign policy. The great combo of archival research done in the US in LSE, London School of Economics, and of course, lots of secondary source of materials that makes the content of the book very rich. Number two, the book reveals some new information that is not known generally, uh, and the assertions are very powerful. Like, for example, isolationism was a myth. It was a myth, but there are many people who still believe that there was a phase in American history which can be characterized as the isolationist period. Number three, the way he analyzed the role of the NGOs or the experts, outside experts, in making a big project on what the US should do after World War II was remarkable. And this is an indication of how the policies are made on even foreign policy matters in a democracy. A lot of lessons for countries like India, whether the foreign policies should be made in MEA or in the cabinet secretariat, or it should be much larger. So a lot of good input to learn from that particular book with so much of rich history and all. Having said that, one or two points that I would like to say. Number one, until and unless some other scholar is able to do more archival research on this particular theme, nobody can challenge the assertion made in the book by Steve. Many people can make many opinions about the book, but I think it says a lot about the question it raises and the way it answers by giving all kinds of evidences, both archival and otherwise, in explaining whatever he intends to say. Armed dominance of the world was decided only in the 1940s, not before that. So even I don't dispute anything on the book. However, look at the title of the book, Tomorrow the World. So in order to know what's happening, what's going to happen tomorrow, as a good historian, he has taken us back to the history. And without history, nobody can even, I'm not talking about prediction, analyze even the trend of what may happen in the future. In that context, I would like to argue like this. While I have no dispute about the question he raises, I myself would raise a different question. Why did the US take a decision for armed dominance over the globe in the 1940s after the Nazis attacked France and not before that? He explains very clearly why it was done at that time. But I am asking the question why it was not done earlier. Because in my view, American history is nothing but a history of expansionism. Just about 1,000 miles up and down a narrow strip of land along the Atlantic, how the US expanded slowly through real estate deals, purchases of land, through even treachery, through diplomacy, through war, to the Pacific coast. Then the desire was insatiable. They go beyond that Pacific coast to Latin America. Monroe Doctrine comes into picture in 1823. And after a couple of decades, then we talk about manifest destiny and Almighty God was invoked to justify the manifest destiny. And later, by 1890, the United States industrial production was double that of Great Britain. But in terms of military capability, it had roughly about 30,000 armed soldiers and 10,000 people in the Navy. And the British military power was five times more powerful than American military. Although the US aspired, a lot of evidences are there, aspired to become a major power, and it became by provoking the Spanish into a war. Although the goal was to liberate Cuba, the first shot was fired in Manila Bay. And then what had happened, we know very well. McKinley went to the extent of justifying colonization of the Philippines by saying that we are going to educate and Christianize those people, without realizing that Filipinos were Christianized for 300 years by the Spaniards. It was a self-serving, generalization, but the fact remains America wanted to have a colony, a currency of power at that time. 10,000 million square miles of territory were colonized by the Europeans. Americans wanted to have some colony somewhere. 150 million people were colonized between 1890 and end of the century. So what I'm arguing is, if you see the American evolution of American history, it was a history of expansionism. I'll not even use the word imperialism. So by World War I, America took a neutral position. Was it really neutral? No. It was in reality helping the Allies and all. The reason why the choice was made, as Steve very nicely puts it in the book, fantastically puts it in the book, in the 1940s, because earlier it was not possible. It was not possible. The design was to slowly spread out. But when the World War II took place, and it was known that American ideals, American culture, American political value will be under big challenge if the Nazis would be able to do whatever they wanted to do, that was the call. And the book beautifully explains how the decision was made. Second point. Steve, one thing is to make an intellectual analysis of when the choice was made and why the choice was made. If you see from the other side, not part of the book, but as I get from the book, the military power, the armed dominance. In 2020, this book was published. In 2020, if you see the CRS report, July 2020, it makes a list of number of times Americans have used military force abroad from 1789 to 2020. It is more than 100. In fact, according to one calculation, on an average, the Americans have used force abroad more than once throughout their history. Right. Now, the reason I'm saying is we have to go beyond the decision taken. Fine. But the implications. And when you see the implications, my next point is this. What is the outcome of this military armed dominance? If you see from World War II onwards, you take the example of any war. The United States, although was #1 military power in the world, it never went alone. Always with others. Korean War, Vietnam War, Afghan War, military intervention in Iraq, you just name it. Everywhere it was a coalition. And why was that? Because even if the goal is armed dominance over the globe to shape the world order, it is just not possible. You need the support, help of other countries to do that. That is why maybe in a sequel book, Steve, you can raise a question. Cuba, a little tiny country, 89 kilometers from the coast of Florida, is still a communist country. Just imagine. And imagine North Korea. And of course, the Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. Forget about the small tiny country, China. You may like it, you may not like it. China is run by a communist party. It has changed its color and policy to make the country more powerful, so much so that the entire American Congress is now busy with how to tackle the Chinese challenge. They are passing a new law, right? So in other words, what I'm hinting at is limits of military power, not just armed dominance, but limits of military power. But in your book, very nicely you have said only the number of tanks and the rockets and the bombs and the missiles are not enough. To play the role of a global leader, you need something else. This is where I'll conclude with the question that you raised, Kashish, about the United Nations. Even Steve will go along with me because in his book he has hinted that. The goal was not to have a world organization. The goal was to have that world organization which will be an instrument of policy for the United States for global leadership. The United States was so keen to play the role in the United Nations until the decolonization process picked up and many African Asian countries became member in General Assembly, that uniting for peace resolution of 1950 type of thing was not possible anymore. Then you say this is a useless body. Why should we spend so much money on this? And later when you realize, initially you took a decision in the Security Council because the Soviet ambassador was absent. And later you realize that Security Council, the so-called big power, big power institution, can become completely useless. Only one country can veto something, you can't do anything about it. If you talk about liberal internationalism, United Nations is important. There's no doubt about it. I am not denigrating the role of the UN at all. But in terms of US foreign policy, it is an instrument which is not working well right now. That is why a lot of questions are being raised in the United States. Finally, let me congratulate Steve. I loved your book. It will be prescribed in my university. Very thoroughly researched, intellectual history. You are a good historian. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to go through the book and make a few remarks in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Let me quickly bring in Dr. Wertheim if you'd like to respond to Ambassador Shankar's point about particularly the Indo-Pacific and the China policy forcing American policymakers to rework or rethink old assumptions, and Professor Mahapatra's point on why you chose Nazi invasion of France as the pivotal point for the birth of internationalism. So.
Wonderful. Well, I'm honored by these comments and very stimulated by the insights in them. So first and foremost, thank you. I certainly agree that the rise of China poses a much more serious challenge for the world and for the United States than any external event aside from 9/11, which is of a totally different nature since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there is a need to be sure to counterbalance China. I think that the risk is that the United States will attempt to do all of the above. It will not retrench in the greater Middle East or in Europe while it attempts to effectuate or continue its pivot to Asia, which has been announced for 1 decade now. And this is the logic of global primacy in action. It does not differentiate sufficiently among threats and set priorities. So there are some in Washington now who really do want to more decisively privilege the Indo-Pacific and make corresponding reductions, but those reductions haven't happened yet. So that's why, I think to the extent one should be concerned about the U.S. response to the rise of China, it is quite notable that the Pentagon's concept of great power competition lumps China and Russia together, even though they are challenges of a completely different magnitude. So I worry about the extension of the logic of armed primacy to the Indo-Pacific, which has caused much grief in the greater Middle East. The wager, I think, some who advocate an increased U.S. role against China, the wager they're making is that the United States will discipline itself in this competition against China. We'll have to see who's right. I hope discipline prevails, but I am concerned about where things might go. And to the question of why the United States didn't make its decision for dominance earlier, I completely agree that the history of the United States is a history of pretty constant expansion. Nor would I necessarily say that the U.S. record from 1945 onward is less violent than the record of expansion across the continent of North America, which involved a colonizing process, even though most U.S. territories that were settled were incorporated into the Union on a basis of formal equality. So I don't think my story is a story of the United States was once upon a time extremely peaceful, and then things took a turn. That's not the
Right.
story. Nor do I use the category of empire very much. For one reason, the United States already had a formal colonial empire. It ruled the Philippines and Puerto Rico in such a fashion coming into World War II. So this isn't a story of the United States not being an empire to becoming an empire. It's, I think, a pretty specific story about the embrace of global hegemony. And I think one major reason why it didn't happen earlier is that, first of all, the U.S. rise to hemispheric dominance served the United States very well for a large portion of time. And the Monroe Doctrine was essentially successful in reducing European influence in the Americas. And then Britain was still very strong, and British world leadership served American interests well. That's why, as I show in the book, when the soon-to-be British ambassador to the United States, Lord Lothian, early in 1939 went to FDR and asked the United States to take the torch of world leadership from Great Britain, FDR just wasn't interested. You know, you guys shoulder the burdens. It is a burdensome thing to be doing that. And so Woodrow Wilson's scheme for the League of Nations was unpopular, or not sufficiently popular, in 1919 and 1920, in part because it did not seem as though the United States would in fact be the senior partner in a relationship with the European great powers. Things changed quickly. So here I should say it's not just the important event of the fall of France that triggers the recalculation, but at the same time, Britain's standing weakens considerably as Britain is challenged by Japan and by the Axis in Europe. So at the same, these two events are happening at the same moment. And so by the end of 1940, really for the first time, the United States could quite correctly reckon that it would be so powerful in the world to come that it would be the senior partner in what was then called an American-British partnership, no longer Anglo-American. And in a sense, U.S. military dominance on a global scale, yes, it would require a departure from the so-called non-entanglement tradition, but some could believe that the United States would not be entangled truly, even if it abandoned the non-entanglement tradition because of the scale of its power and the unique way in which the United States gained economically, gained geopolitically from World War II in a way that no other participant in the war could possibly do.
Right. Thank you, sir. I see quite a few questions pouring in, and we'll get to them shortly. Let me quickly get in our last two discussants. Nikhila, if I may. In his book, Dr. Wertheim deems American internationalism to be unique in the sense that it claims to not seek to domineer or exploit nations. That sounds awfully like, a lot like the American rhetoric currently with respect to the Indo-Pacific. So, in context of your recent work on the 5G, on the Indo-Pacific region, would you then characterize the internationalization of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept as nothing but the export of an Americanized idea of internationalism? Or would you really say that there is an ideological contest between democracies and autocracies here in the region?
Thank you, Kashish. And congratulations to Dr. Stephen Wertheim for a fabulous book. I was able to read quite a bit of it over the weekend, so thank you for giving us that. Kashish, trust a colleague to pull some old work of yours and connect it to a book discussion. So I study the internet and the digital public square. That's my research area. And what I found fascinating is, of course, I agree with all the speakers until now, and I liked Ambassador Meera Shankar's remarks about how this challenges conventional wisdom. Absolutely, it does. The introductory chapter does that. And then I liked the energy in Professor Mahapatra's comments, especially about how American history is the history of expansionism. I like the energy that you brought to it. Thank you. But for me personally, I like how Dr. Wertheim frames this as a choice. And why am I saying that in the context of even what Kashish asked me is this, that when you look at the 5G debate or how nation states are taking these decisions, this template that Wertheim offers is a nice way for us to construct how are nation states deciding their choices at a time when the playing field is not a physical space, but it is the pipes through which information flows. How are those choices being made? If it was CFR, which Wertheim notes in his book at great length, who are those lobbyists and who are those people in the room now taking those decisions about how the digital public square must be regulated? So I think I take that away. As far as 5G is concerned, really, we looked at almost 30 countries across the globe, and everywhere, local governments were making their own decisions on where they stand between no Huawei, and yes to the Chinese companies. And it's been primarily dominated by local concerns, local culture. We're seeing that in India too right now. India and Australia are far, far ahead of media regulation than the US. Europe started it, but now Australia and India have decided, okay, the platforms, big tech can no longer say they're just dumb pipes. We are going to decide where the red lines are. So I think the templates that Dr. Wertheim's work offers is excellent for those studying various other disciplines too. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Let me quickly move to Mr. Vergees George, who is also the author of Open Embrace, which, in my humble opinion, is one of the best books on contemporary India-US ties. And why do I say that? It's because Mr. George very well draws parallels between the American right and the Indian right, particularly under Donald Trump and Narendra Modi. So, keeping that in mind, Mr. George, I want to understand from you, how do you now assess parallels between India and the US at a time when you have the Biden administration once again reviving liberal internationalism, at least in rhetoric, right? In terms of also getting the kind of Obama era officials on board. And you have the Modi government here, which is speaking of an inward, self-reliant, Atmanirbhar disposition. How do you then alter your thesis with respect to your book? And of course, we would love to know your thoughts on Dr. Wertheim's book as well.
Well, thank you, Kashish, for those nice words, and many congratulations to Stephen for a fantastic book. I mean, as a history student myself, I am for history's sake, but as a political observer and commentator, when history illuminates our present and our future course, that is even more exciting, and that is what this book has done for me, and I'm sure it will do the same for a lot of readers who are interested in the evolution of America, not only as a democracy, but as a global superpower. I will come to your question, Kashish. Before that, I will make a few quick points. Reading this book through the prism of some of the contemporary challenges that we face, 4 or 5 quick points. Now, the idea of American century, as Stephen says, 1941 is when we hear about that concept. And from 1941 to 1991, there is a constant ascent of that concept. In exactly 50 years, with the collapse of communism, or not communism so much I would say, but the collapse of Soviet Union, in 50 years, it reaches its peak. And the next decades, until today, 30 years or so, you see the challenges to the American-led world order that we continue to grapple with and debate upon. So from a time when the American policy elites decided that they would prefer order over pacifism, which at least a segment of American thinkers thought was their own self-perception. I mean, that itself is being questioned by Professor Mahapatra, and there is, it's a very thin argument to make about American pacifism before 1940s. So, but that apart, so order became the primary pursuit of the United States, and to impose order, enforce order, you use force. And then we are here trying to enforce various types of order at various points in history and at various locations. So that is one point. So that the first 50 years and the 30 years that followed, that demarcation, reaching a climax and then coming down and facing all challenges. Ambassador Meera Shankar spoke about one set of challenges which actually been brought about by globalization and economic integration. So that is number one. Number two, this book throws light on a very specific manner in which the United States try to define what its future course should be, which is primarily you build a strawman argument, which is a binary conceptions are made as isolationism becomes an opposite of non-interventionism, and then internationalism becomes a proxy for supremacy. And at some points in the book, Stephen also raises the question where at what point does internationalism, that the distinction of the line between even internationalism and imperialism also gets broken. There are people who raise that point in much earlier in the debate as well. So these creation of these binaries, most of the time it could be imaginary, sometimes they are real. That becomes a foundation of America's definition of itself and the enemy. Now, with the collapse of Soviet Union in 1991, and subsequently, there is an erasure of these binaries, which is causing almost a cognitive dissonance in US strategy. Now, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, these documents that actually came about in the last few years, you're trying to force that argument of a binary world where great power rivalry is back, but then you can't actually list who's your rival. So you have a list of rivals. You have China, you have Russia, you have Islamists, you have North Korea. So end of the day, you get about to define the binary world, but then you list out 5 opponents which are all threatening America, you actually end up in more confusion than when you set about to seek that. So that is the second point which the book actually opened my thoughts to. And the third point is that in the time that Stephen discussed in this book, again, it's a very sharp focus on 4 or 5 years. Within that 4 or 5 years, 18 months from the fall of France to the Pearl Harbor attack, even further a sharp focus. So here he raises this point that this commentator Isaiah Bowman is asking, how is our idea of a world order different from the Nazi conception of a world order? So decades earlier, a Wilsonian idea of a 1,000-year regime, which is of a biblical dream that he imagined where he would lead, had already preceded. And lo and behold, Hitler himself is imagining a 1,000-year-old world order which will last, which will be based on Nazist ideology, which will spread over the world and system. Now you come back to day before yesterday's press conference where Vladimir Putin is asking what happened to the protesters who are at the Capitol Hills. You're asking me this question. You should ask this question yourself. So now we are in a position, we are in that particular moment in history where the United States is finding it pretty difficult to defend its own narrative of its own goodness and the inevitability of its democratic system and its moral superiority over the other system. Now, this is not a challenge that did not exist when President Wilson was pursuing a very idealistic global agenda. Now, Walter Russell Mead would characterize Wilson himself as an egregious racist. Now, as recently, a couple of years ago, what the biggest of all cancellation in the U.S. contemporary history was Wilson's own removal from Princeton University's Hall of Famous People that it is. So now, it is not a coincidence that in the last 35 years, post the collapse of Soviet Union, which was marked as a triumph of US liberalism, that in exactly around that period, there is a five-fold increase in the number of prisoners that the US has. 2.2 million, highest per capita imprisonment, incarceration in any other part of the world. Now, the irony of it, that you are, on the one hand, getting into, you are starting the celebration of the triumph of liberalism, and on the other hand, to manage your own order, you have to do all these kind of management within the system, which is quite often violent. So that is what I would call the cost of grand strategy. The cost of grand strategy is often paid by the weaker within the society, and this is a lesson that India, which is now actually trying to pursue a great grand strategy, and there is a cost to be paid. If you want to know what that cost is, US is one example, but US, because of its prosperity and wealth and might, that is very well below it. But there are much worse examples of the cost of grand strategy. And my second last point is, Stephen raises in very interesting manner this moral superiority that is claimed for air power and naval power as opposed to land power. Now, so that is quite fascinating now, because again, Nicola mentioned that. Now we have come to a place where supremacy, domination is through technological superiority. The current battle that US and China are fighting is for the technologies of the future. Now, for all what Trump is often blamed for, one thing that his focus has been very sharp on is pouring money into new AI research, etc., etc. So now at that point, how we will take the idea of dominance and how we will try to fight future battles, some of it can be deeply unsettling. I happen to see one of these episodes in Black Mirror, where you can actually engineer the thinking of a soldier who will be a human soldier. Forget about the robotic soldier. Even a human soldier can be forced to think in a particular manner and see the enemy in a particular way. So this is the future of warfare, and this is also the future of military dominance. Now, when we talk about that, again, one significant challenge that the US is fighting, is dealing with within itself, is how to deal with your own big tech companies. Now, a Hamiltonian vision of US strategy involved that, okay, there is a near total convergence between the interest of the US big capitalist companies and US national interest. Now it is actually reached a pinnacle where it is very clear these companies have become global entities of their own. They have their own agenda. They a series of congressional hearings and debates that are happening within India actually raises a challenge of how the US will deal with this in the coming decades. Finally, I'll come to the question that you raised, Ashish. So Stephen's book actually deals only in background about an internal process that is going on in the United States. That is President Roosevelt himself renegotiating the social contract of US democracy. While he is imagining a new role for the United States into the world stage, he is also settling the internal debate, the crisis in US capitalism, as Theodore Roosevelt tried to address it in a very marginal fashion in the beginning of the century. But Roosevelt is the one who actually, FDR is the one who actually tackles it. And then he deals with it and comes up with a new deal, which is actually a new form of social contract. Now, the US, the challenge to US supremacy, the US dominance, or the US world order is as much as because due to the rise of other powers and etc. It is also a challenge for the US to deal with domestically. How do you renegotiate the social contract? As Ambassador Meera Shankar said, how do you ensure that there is no resentment, disenchantment, which is destabilizing the society from within? It cannot be achieved by throwing more people into prison and to say that anybody who is questioning an election is a non-patriot. Even in India, India may not be as big, great a democracy as the United States. Questioning the legitimacy of election is fundamentally a democratic right. If I think that this election is not legitimate, there has to be an open debate. You cannot charge people for saying that, okay, there are issues to be addressed about this question. So the point, therefore, the challenge before the Biden administration is, therefore, I would say that renegotiating a social contract to stabilize US domestically, unless he does that, what we saw in Trump was only, as Stephen rightly put, only a symptom of a bigger, deeper malaise. If somebody who is more disciplined and better articulate champion of that disenchantment and that dissentment, if ever comes into US political space, we will actually be going into a further slide into another round of chaos. So I think that there I would stop there. I think that actually is a challenge before Biden and his new administration.
Thank you. Dr. Wertheim, would you like to respond to the final discussants, particularly with respect to how do you see American internationalism evolving in the digital age?
Sure. Well, thank you for these wonderfully wide-ranging comments. Let me start with the idea that the United States is finding it difficult to define its own goodness. I think that's important because the U.S. commitment to primacy, yes, it rested on assumptions about the world, that the world, to have a decent kind of order, requires an armed enforcer. But it also relies on the presumption that the United States was unquestionably suited to play that role in a moral sense, as well as because of its resources. And that has come under question in a profound way in the United States, not to mention internationally. And you see the president, Joe Biden, trying to walk a line. He is trying to promote democracy, but in a chastened way that openly recognizes that this is something the United States itself is struggling with. And a lot of what he's trying to do, both domestically and internationally, is trying to show that democracy can deliver for people in an attempt, I think, to kind of renegotiate the social contract. Donald Trump, very surprisingly, was not an American exceptionalist. He did favor U.S. military dominance and increased U.S. defense budgets accordingly. But his theory was not that the U.S. was morally superior or represented an advanced political model to which others should aspire. And so that's very interesting that he's detached the notion of exceptionalism, or you might say liberalism, from hegemony. I think the question about 5G and a world of advanced technology is a really interesting one. I was maybe in a fortunate position as a historian to be able to track down this small group of people who at least could think that they could plan the world's future at a particular moment in time. They didn't really plan the future of the world. They reshaped America's sense of what it wanted to do in the world. But nevertheless, they had a very strong sense that they were actually defining the fate of mankind for a long period of time. Even on the issues of U.S. security policy, it's a different situation today. The U.S. has a vast bureaucracy, and it's actually become harder to make coherent strategizing, I think, for the United States by virtue, ironically, of the very expansion of the national security state and associated think tanks that employ people like me. This is thus the product of exactly the commitment to primacy that this small group of planners that I was able to trace came up with. So that's so to actually, historians of the future will have to take a different approach, I think, to do similar kinds of work. And that's before we even get to 5G and other forms of technology in which the decisions are decentralized. They are, as we've mentioned, made most of the time by countries individually with different constellations of international institutions and fora that may be participating. So I look forward to those who want to undertake the challenge of really understanding how to tell a story that's centered on power and choices of people with power that's appropriate to the world of today.
Right. Let me stick with you, Dr. Wertheim, for a quick audience question. We have Vibhuti Mudliar, who spoke about the lack of adequate representation of new powers on the UN Security Council. Now, I want to understand, at a time when there are evident doubts about the efficacy of the US led liberal order, wouldn't America championing UN reforms be a good realpolitik way of actually renewing the mandate of American internationalism? Or do you think I'm just overtly optimistic here?
Well, it seems like it must be overly optimistic, because I must say that UN reform, which was on the margins of the US foreign policy agenda in the 1990s and maybe the early aughts, is completely gone. Nobody talks about it. I think Bernie Sanders in the last campaign mentioned the UN a few times. He was probably the only person to do so. And so if you take the analysis of the book seriously, I think that the UN played an important legitimating role for the United States and its exercise of power early on. And then once it seemed to serve that purpose less and less for the United States became more skeptical of the UN, and then at times has turned against it, especially on the political right in the United States. So yes, I think it would certainly make a statement beyond the substance for the United States to push for reform of the Security Council and perhaps a new role for the General Assembly. But I just don't see any signs whatsoever of that happening. And in a 100-year or so time horizon in which international organization has been conceived and has been with us, I'm not sure there's another period of a decade or so in which the U.S. discussion, even under the frame of internationalism, has featured less thought about new international institutions or serious reform of the ones that exist.
Right. I think on that very sobering note, thank you for bursting my bubble on extreme optimism. It reminds me of one of the quotes that you cite in your book by non interventionist John Bassett Moore, who said that the UN is nothing but an opportunity for the US to cast its rivals as enemies of the world, against whom all is permitted, and enlarge local disputes into global wars. So I think that remains to be the reality. And once again, congratulations, Dr. Wertheim, on the publication of this very timely book. Let me also thank all our discussants for taking their valuable time out to participate today. And thank you to the viewers. We will be back with another engaging book discussion very soon. Thank you so much. Until then, take care, stay safe.